These are Chris Griffin's worst ever moments in Family Guy. We kick things off at number 10 with Steroids, an episode where popularity makes Chris treat Meg even worse than usual. Chris's story begins at school when he and Meg encounter Connie D'Amico, the most popular girl. Connie makes fun of Meg and a CD she gave her. Later, Connie decides she needs a new challenge, and she sets her sights on Chris, a known loser, with the intention of making him popular. She surprises him by asking him on a date. To her surprise, he is genuinely nice to her and compliments her, which throws Connie for a loop since no boy has ever treated her that way. The next day, Chris and Connie make their relationship official, and Chris's popularity skyrockets. He undergoes a major transformation in both his style and attitude. At his party, Meg, hoping to finally be friends with Connie, is told by Chris that she's not invited, calling her not cool kid material. While Meg spends the night crying, Chris is caught making out with two other girls. Connie is furious, but Chris dismisses her, explaining he has grown past the need for Connie. Humiliated, Connie seeks help from Meg, who agrees to assist after Chris hits her with a javelin. The two plot their revenge by broadcasting an embarrassing video of Chris's Buffalo Bill impression to the entire school. Humiliated, Chris is rejected from the popular crowd, and Connie's status is restored. She thanks Meg and immediately goes back to hating her. At number 9, becoming homecoming king spells trouble for others and Chris run. During a lonely lunch with his friend Neil, Chris overhears that nominations for homecoming king are in. Believing that popularity will solve his loneliness, he decides to run. Lois worries he'll be heartbroken when he inevitably loses, but Chris is genuinely excited. To everyone's surprise, he wins homecoming king. The next day, Chris celebrates, while Meg, Brian, and Stewie worry he's going to be the victim of a prank. Brian and Stewie investigate and discover that Chris's classmates voted for him out of pity because they believe he is special. They decide not to tell Chris, but the newfound popularity has already gone to his head. Chris acts like an arrogant jerk, even going to the bathroom in a waffle iron and insulting Brian by saying he's just jealous. Brian, fed up, spills the truth, but Chris refuses to believe him, convinced the dance will be the greatest night of his life. At the dance, Chris realizes he was just a joke when the homecoming queen is revealed to be a girl who died in a car crash. His reign as king ends after he kicks over the deceased girl's memorial. At number 8 is Trading Places, where the stress of full-time work drives Chris to a heart attack. Chris and Meg are caught joyriding on Peter's dirt bike and end up wrecking it. Frustrated with her children's sense of privilege, Lois proposes an experiment. The parents and kids trade places for a week. Chris goes to work at the brewery, and Meg does the housework, while Peter and Lois go to high school. Chris impresses Peter's boss, Angela, at the brewery, and Meg excels at her housework. Peter and Lois, however, are miserable at school, admitting it's harder than being an adult. They decide to call off the experiment, but Chris informs them they can't because Angela has fired Peter and hired him, making him the new breadwinner. As the new breadwinner, Chris is forced to continue working to pay the bills, but the heavy workload and stress quickly take a toll. He becomes angry and depressed. One night, while arguing with Meg about their finances, Chris has a heart attack and collapses. He makes a full recovery and admits that adult life is much harder than he once thought. Chris continues to disrespect his family in number 7 when he takes Stewie hostage in Secondhand Spoke. After being picked on by 4 bullies, an embarrassed Chris runs away. Back home, Stewie takes pity on him and offers to teach him how to stand up for himself. The next day, with Stewie in his backpack, Chris confronts the bullies. Stewie whispers insults into his ear, and Chris wins the verbal battle, which boosts his confidence. Chris becomes an insult, Yoda, even helping his friend Neil. When he's nominated for student body president, he's terrified when Stewie tells him he's taught him everything he knows and that Chris must go on alone. Desperate, Chris kidnaps Stewie, locking him in his backpack for 5 days. During the election, Stewie refuses to speak for him, reminding him that he's become the very thing he hated, a bully. Racked with guilt, Chris releases Stewie and drops out of the race. Stewie reveals that he had already gotten rid of the bullies for good by tricking them into shooting themselves. The happy ending is put on hold, but Chris is no longer being bullied. At number 6, Chris's pimple is the one calling the shots in Brian the Bachelor. Chris enters the kitchen with a massive pimple on his cheek. The family makes fun of him, but Chris becomes attached to the pimple, naming him Doug. That night, Doug starts talking to Chris, convincing him to sneak out and cause trouble. Chris and Doug begin a crime spree, lighting a bag on fire on Joe's porch and vandalizing a shop wall. Lois becomes suspicious. The next morning, the family discovers the pharmacy has been broken into and all the acne medication has been destroyed. Joe comes over with proof that it was Chris. In his room, Chris expresses regret and says he won't listen to Doug anymore. But the zit takes over Chris's motor functions, making him punch himself. Terrified, Chris gives in to Doug's demands. Chris tricks Doug into going to a dermatologist, where he disarms the pimple and ends his reign of terror. Although Chris wasn't in total control, he still gave in to peer pressure and committed crimes. Our journey to this list first starts with Peter, who's introduced to the wonderful world of phone apps. After he gets a new phone, he gives his old, broken one to Chris. The next day at school, Chris and his friend Mort are admiring a girl named Miller. Mort advises Chris to send an inappropriate picture of himself to get her attention. Chris, with his new-to-him phone, takes and sends the picture. Of course, the plan backfires spectacularly. Chris, his parents, and Joe are all called to the principal's office. Miller did not appreciate the unsolicited picture, and since Chris is a minor, Joe labels him a registered sex offender. Chris's name, face, and crime are immediately broadcast on the news. The law gives him two choices: take a rehabilitation course run by Quagmire or opt for chemical castration. Chris chooses the course, but even after graduating, he is still shunned by his classmates. Desperate to escape his new identity, Chris makes a drastic decision. He undergoes chemical castration. The family is shocked, but Chris believes this is the only way to ensure no one ever thinks of him as a creep again. Lois tries to convince him to go off the pills, but Chris refuses. Surprisingly, his life begins to turn around. With his mind no longer focused on girls, his grades improve drastically. He excels in biology, gets the highest score on his Spanish test, and joins the debate team. However, during a tutoring session, Marcy, the girl who got him in trouble, apologizes and places a friendly hand on his shoulder. The touch reignites his libido, and he runs off in a panic. Chris started this episode by doing something terrible to someone else, only to end up doing something terrible to himself as a result. Things take a violent turn at number 4 as Chris purposefully hurts his girlfriend and Brian in Long John Peter. While taking Brian to the vet, Chris develops a crush on an intern named Anna. He becomes desperate to see her again, and Lois jokingly says it will happen if Brian gets sick again. Chris takes this literally, returning home to intentionally injure Brian. The family ends up back at the vet, where Chris manages to get Anna's number and a date. Their first date at an Italian restaurant seems to go well, but leave it to Chris to almost ruin it by asking if she's ever made it with one of the dogs. Anna, strangely unfazed, tells him to relax, admits she likes him, and plants a big fat kiss on him. Anna later comes to Chris's house to hang out, but when she gets up to leave, she accidentally spills her drink. Chris offers to clean it up, but Peter, ever the father of the year, insists Chris should treat her like crap to get her to like him. Taking his dad's terrible advice, Chris becomes a complete jerk, and Anna, now seeing his true colors, dumps him. Heartbroken, Chris goes to Lois for advice. She tells him to find an excuse to see her again. So Chris, once again, intentionally hurts Brian. He sees Anna, apologizes for his behavior, and they reconcile with another kiss. The two agree to one more date, but Brian, who is once again in pain, objects. At number 3, Chris is pressured by popularity once again into kidnapping Meg in Better Off Meg. Meg arrives at school to find it empty and learns it's skip day, but no one told her. Rejected by her family, who are having a fun day at the fair with a barrel they think is her, she spends the day alone at a bowling alley. That evening, the news reports on a teenage girl killed in a car crash who was identified by her driver's license. The Griffins are notified, and Joe reveals Meg is dead. It turns out the bowling alley attendant accidentally switched Meg's ID with the deceased girl's. At Meg's funeral, Chris realizes he's getting a ton of attention from girls and guys because his sister died, and he loves it. Meg, who is there watching, is so distraught by the small attendance and lack of kind words that she decides to move away and start a new life. She does well for herself, but she eventually misses her family. Chris, who is now living the high life as the cool kid with the dead sister, gets a call from Meg, who is alive and well. Not wanting to give up his newfound popularity, he kidnaps her and leaves her tied up in an abandoned warehouse. While Meg is tied up, the school holds a memorial ceremony for her. Fueled by anger, Meg savagely smashes her face against the ground to create enough blood to slide out of her restraints. She bursts into the auditorium, bloody and not well, and points at Chris. Everyone thinks she means he saved her life, and he's carried out like a hero. Chris kidnapped his sister for popularity and is even praised for it. At number 2, Chris gets in trouble with private pictures yet again in teacher's heavy pet. Chris is once again elected homecoming dunce, and Lois announces she's a new substitute teacher at his school. Chris is mortified, but Lois, going by her maiden name, promises to be discreet. At school, Chris gets invited to sit with the popular kids, who ask if he thinks Mrs. Peterschmidt is hot. He agrees, and when they see him getting in the car with her, they fantasize that Chris is a selfless lover. Chris plays along, and his popularity skyrockets. When the kids get suspicious, they demand a naked picture of Mrs. Peterschmidt. Chris sneaks into the bathroom to take a picture of his mom in the shower, and Quagmire, hiding in a stall, encourages him to go through with it. Chris takes the picture and sends it to the popular kids, who promise not to share it, but the photo is immediately sent to everyone in the school. Lois is called to the principal's office and is shocked when she sees the photo. She gives Chris an ultimatum: tell the truth or she will. He comes clean to his peers, but Lois, seeing his reputation vanish, valiantly backtracks and corroborates his story. She ends up serving 6 years in prison for having a relationship with a minor, and Chris's popularity soars. Finally, at number 1, Chris continues to bring the hurt. Only this time it nearly kills Stewie in Brian Griffin's House of Pain. Chris sneaks into Meg's room and reads her diary. The two scuffle over the book, and their fight spills into the hallway, where an oblivious Stewie becomes their victim. The two siblings check on him and see that he's still breathing but has a large gash on his head and is vomiting. Chris and Meg take Stewie to his bed, worrying that he's unconscious. They try to hide his injuries from Lois with a cowboy hat and by doing a terrible ventriloquist act. The next day, Peter discovers that Stewie has been unconscious, but instead of helping, he admits to having knocked out all of his children at one point or another. He agrees to help them hide it. The family brings Stewie to Brian's television show with drawn-on eyes and a stick to make his arm move. Everyone buys it. After what seems like days, the trio checks on Stewie, whose head is now bruised and swollen. Meg begs them to take him to the hospital, but Peter has one last trick up his sleeve. Lois's first instinct is to try to cover it up, but she finally agrees to go to the hospital. This was a worse moment for Chris, Meg, and Peter.